Do you think you know human nature? Well, our speaker is a lecturer in primate behavior at the Origins of Mind group in the University of St. Andrews in St. Andrews, Scotland. She spent the past 15 years living and working with wild primates across Africa, and in particular, the chimpanzees of the Budongo forest. Through long-term field studies, she explores what the behavior of great apes living in their natural environment tells us about their minds and about the evolutionary origins of our own behavior. You may have seen her on BBC, National Geographic, or on Nova, which is where I first saw her. She's joining us today from her office. So let's go ape and have an exotic welcome for Dr. Kat Hobaiter.
All right, this is a brave new world for me as a field primatologist, so bear with me. I am not usually doing things with all of this amazing technology that we have available to us now, but I think hopefully I can, where did my mouse go?
You're doing great.
Make you guys, okay, right, good. Then can everyone hear me and see? Did that all work okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic, brilliant, thank you. Well, hey, thank you very much for having me this morning, and also for taking the time so early in your day to let me introduce you to the pretty wonderful world, as I see it, of great ape communication. Please do feel free to jump in at any point if you have questions. I'm trying to work out if I can get the chat pane up, but maybe if someone has a question, the host could just let me know, and I'm more than happy to kind of play this really informally or to ramble away for the next half an hour and to kind of take any questions you guys have afterwards. So
I'll help you out, Kat.
That's fantastic, thank you very much. All right, let's get stuck in. So, okay, language, right? It is one of the most powerful social tools that any species has evolved, right? You know, we access language in so many different forms, whether it's different dialects, different languages. We have all those different modalities, if it's spoken, if it's signed, if it's written. There's all of that rich variation, but we all use it for essentially the same sorts of reasons. We use it for things like poetry, we use it for things like theoretical physics, but probably more typically we use it for things like gossiping with our neighbors and putting terrible cat memes on the internet and all of the other day-to-day ways in which it sort of makes our lives kind of go forward. But despite centuries of thought and decades of intensive study at this point, we don't really have a good handle on where language came from, where language evolved, how we have this remarkable capacity. What did we need as a species to communicate that means that we went beyond, apparently, the systems of signals that we see used, if whether we're looking at birdsong or dogs or other primates that are kicking about in the world today. Okay, so a couple of caveats here. One of them is that, sorry, I'm going way too through. Okay, that's better. All right, a couple of caveats here. I work as somebody who wants to understand the evolution of human behavior. That is absolutely what I tell my head of school when I ask him to go to the rainforest, and what I tell all of the people that I ask grant funding for is this is all about human behavior, right? We want to know about ourselves. But I will fully confess to the fact that most primate species, I find them fascinating in their own right. I mean, many of the reasons I've spent years living with and studying chimpanzees is because I'm fascinated and really privileged to try and understand what it means to be a chimpanzee, what it means to be a gorilla. Not just because they help us understand our own evolution. I mean, one of the things that I think I would say straight up front is that this image that you see on your screens, this very typical, the progression of man, right? This is not how evolution works. We are not some kind of perfect end state that evolution has been working towards. We are one of many, many diverse species. So if we get rid of that and we put that up, this is a lot better of a picture from my perspective. And I think if we look at that incredible radiation of life, it gives us a sense of, you know, our own place in it. And it's a pretty good check on any grand ideas we might get about just how important we are in the picture. And I think something that you will see really commonly when you hear people talking about the evolution of human behavior, when you see so many different nature documentaries comparing what animals do and don't do, is we take this anthropocentric perspective. We put humans in the middle and we compare ourselves to everything else going on. Now, one of the problems with doing that is we're going to see what's similar to us. But if other primates have their own extraordinary capacities that don't look like ours, we risk missing out on ever recognizing them. So I think it's really important, as much as possible, to remember our place in this and to also consider things from both sides of that perspective as much as we can. Okay. So nevertheless, with that caveat, we are incredibly self-obsessed as a species, and we've always been fascinated by these questions of what makes us different, right? We might not be able to ask what makes us special, because we are not, but we can ask what makes us different. And the first sort of version of this that kicked about for an awfully long time was we were man the tool maker. We were not just a species that used tools, but we actually made our own tools from the environment in order to modify it, whether that was finding food or whatever we chose to do. But of course, very famously now, in the 1960s, Jane Goodall went out to Gombe and saw for the first time those chimpanzees not just using tools, but making tools. So what we had was, in her case, they were fashioning from blades of grass these long kind of probes and making a little brush at one end so they could fit it into an ant nest and pull it out and kind of scoop all the ants out with it. Now, this is not a Gombe chimpanzee, this is Gege, he lives in West Africa, but what he's got are two stones there, and he's using them as a hammer and an anvil to smash open the nuts that are around, because they're too hard to bite into. So it's hard, I think, now to remember just how groundbreaking this was. We've all seen like a million PBS and Nova and BBC wonderful documentaries about animals and their cultures and their tool use. And it's hard to imagine just how much of a shift this was, particularly for scientists, in our perception of what we were as a species. And there's that very, very famous quote from Louis Leakey that is well overused now in my field, but it's because it's a very good one, which is, when Jane Goodall wrote to him and said, "I've seen this, this is what is happening," he said, "Now we have to redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human. Those are our options as a species." Now, it was very difficult to redefine tool because we had a pretty good definition of what a tool was. That's a pretty objective thing. And certainly in the 60s, we weren't quite ready yet to accept chimpanzees as human, or at least not globally, shall we say. We weren't quite ready to talk about, pan sapiens. So we did what we always do as a species. We shifted the goalposts and we said, oh yeah, well, okay, fine. They can be tool makers, but we're something different. We're something special in a different way. And the way we shifted the goalposts was this. We said, okay, what fundamentally underpins our uniqueness as a species is language, is this incredible system of communication we have. And so we were man the linguist. And there are a few different ways over the years that we've explored this. And I'd like to just very briefly introduce you to one of the classics, and then I'll tell you a lot more about what I do and why I do it differently. And one of the reasons I'd like to introduce you to one of the classics is that you guys would have had some of these apes pretty much on your doorstep there in San Francisco not that long ago. There were incredible studies being done in California in the 60s and 70s. And they were the ape language projects. There were a few scattered around America, but the basic premise of these ape language projects was to raise a young ape in a human household and to treat them as if they were a human child. And what they wanted to do was to explore this question of, is our capacity for human language something that is fundamentally human? You need a human brain, you need a human body to be able to acquire language. Or is it something about the environment? If you grow up in a human household and with language using humans around you, is that enough? I mean, it seems quite clear if you were to be allowed, which you definitely wouldn't be, to take a young baby and pop them on a desert island in a non-human household, they're not going to acquire language, right? They're not going to have anything like the system of communication that we do. So there's clearly something in our environment. This is not just a reflexive behavior that all humans will produce no matter what happens. The environment is important, but how important is it? That's what they wanted to get to. And so what they did was take these apes and raise them basically as children. So they did start out with a couple of early goes at teaching spoken language, which failed. And if you'd like to ask questions, please do later on. But where this field really took off was Washoe. And Washoe was a young female chimpanzee who was taught signs from American Sign Language. And by the age of about 5 or 6, she could use about 150 signs. And for me, what was really incredible about Washoe was not just that she acquired all of these different signs that she could use, but what she did, how she used them, what she would do with them. And the anecdotes from her upbringing are really like what you would hear, you know, with a young toddler in the house. So Washoe, like all of these apes, was raised as a child. She was dressed. She sat at the breakfast table and ate her cereal with a bowl and spoon. She slept in her own little bed at night. She would break out of her room and go and raid the fridge. And when she would go and raid the fridge, then she would sign to herself, "Be quiet," or she'll be quiet as she'd go down the corridor. She would, at night alone in her room, use her favorite signs and just sort of babble to herself as she was starting to explore this system that she was being exposed to. Impressively, a few years later, when she was much older, she would use signs with other chimpanzees, she'd use signs with other humans, but they brought a young male chimpanzee, Luli, into the family. And at that point, all the humans in the household stopped signing when he arrived, but he still learned a whole bunch of signs. So he had a great repertoire of signs himself. And that means at this point, you have a young male chimp who has learned an impressive repertoire of signs from another chimpanzee, because that's the only place he could have picked them up, who is using them in a way that's very familiar for, you know, young children exploring their own first steps into language. Now, the absolute queen of the ape sign language projects was Coco. And this is Coco with Penny Patterson. Coco passed away a couple of years ago now, but before she died, she had about 1,000 different signs in American Sign Language that she could use. She could understand about 2,000 words of English. And again, the way in which she used them, she would tell stories, she would play, she would, I mean, there's a wonderful anecdote Robert Sapolsky tells of his early grad student years working with Coco. When Coco was in the university, she's left in one of the testing rooms and Penny Patterson pops out to go and do something. And there's a potted plant in the corner of the room. And what happens when you leave a gorilla in a room with a plant in it? Well, they're gorillas. She ate the plant. It's what, you know, they're pretty omnivorous when it comes to scoffing anything that they can that way. But when someone came back in, so when Penny comes back in, Penny asks, "Where's the plant, Coco?" And Coco signs, "Bill ate it." Bill is the grad student that she doesn't really get on with very well at this point. And Penny signs, "Coco, come on, Bill is a human. People don't eat plants." And Coco at this point doubles down and says, "The other gorilla ate it." Now, Coco is the only gorilla in the Institute or the wider kind of area at this point. But the reason I love that anecdote is it's about how it's like you find a toddler, they have their hand in the cookie jar, and they're just going to lie to you and double down on that lie. "I am definitely not stealing the cookies." It's this sort of playful use of language that's really familiar to us. Okay, so given these early successes, why do I have a job today? Why don't we have an answer to this question? Why didn't we get it in the 60s? Well, I'm hoping this is going to work. I'm going to play a little video, and I'd just like you to pay attention to what Coco does and then what Penny says. So this is Penny many years after this picture interacting with Coco.
Who is that? Think me there. Okay, that is you. Gorilla, animal, Coco love. Okay, that's very good. That is you. You are a lovely animal.
Okay, so these kind of clips are all over the place. Everybody is moved by them. They clearly have an incredible bond. But if I'm going to put my objective science hat on, which is after all my job, then what Coco signed there was gorilla and love. And what Penny Patterson said was, yes, you are a lovely gorilla. That's not necessarily what Coco signed. Coco could have been signing, I love gorillas, gorillas like love, gorillas are lovely. She could have just been signing, gorilla, totally different thought, love. The tendency to read in to what somebody else is saying is a really natural part of our social relationships, especially with family and friends. And that's the problem at the heart of these studies. When you raise an ape in your household, you raise them as family. That's the whole point. They were raised as children. You start to guess the end of their sentences. You start to decide you know what they really mean. I mean, we do that all the time with our family and friends, you know, or we know that our cat really means to tell us that they desperately need to go out right now because they hate the rain or something. It's just a very natural human tendency. But we can't collect scientific data that way because it's not a good way to be sure about what's going on. Now, if you do the flip side, which people did as well, there's a guy called Hobaiter, who tried to do this much more objectively with a lot more, without that kind of close social bonding situation going on. Well, there, the apes didn't really learn how to sign, and they certainly didn't communicate or use their signs in a language-like way, but of course they didn't. They were like the children raised on a desert island with nobody to talk to. You only learn language and how to use language when you're raised in a social family situation. And so this is this dilemma at the heart of this. You can either do this in a way where you give the apes the full chance to express language, but you lose that scientific objectivity, or you do the science, but then nothing works. And in the early 1980s, basically, this whole field implodes, and it's why we don't see studies like this done anymore, both because the science itself failed, but probably more importantly to me personally is because by doing these studies and by getting to know these extraordinary apes like Washoe and Coco and Luli and Dar and all of the others, we learned something about what it means to be an ape that we didn't realize. I mean, Coco was on the cover of Time magazine 3 times, right? She was this iconic image of this animal who had broken down the barriers between what it meant to be a human or what it meant to be an animal. And we realized how fundamentally unethical it is to do this kind of work. You know, if you raise these young apes in a human family, that's great for a few years, but you can never return them. You certainly can never return them to the wild, but you also can't return them to other apes when they grow up. They think they're humans. They were raised to be human. They never really reintegrate, and often they lived very damaged lives for the rest of their lives. It was really tragic what happened. So we don't do that kind of work anymore that way. But how do we do that kind of work? Okay, so let me introduce you to what I do as a primatologist who's interested in these kind of questions. Right. If I was interested in our physical development, then I could go and dig up the bones to look at when our bodies shifted to upright walking. I could dig up finger bones that tell us when we were climbers and when we stopped being climbers by their curvature. I could dig up stone tools and look at the transition of our tool use, but I can't dig up the fossilized aspects of our behavior. I certainly can't dig up the fossilized, words don't make good fossils. I can't dig up the first preposition that kind of came out of our language use. So I have to go at this from a different angle if I'm interested in the evolution of where our language came from. And the way I do it is to look across modern primate species. And what I'm definitely not doing is taking chimpanzees as some kind of model for how humans used to be. Because modern chimpanzees and modern humans had an ancestor in common, but we've both evolved since then. So what I'm doing is looking across all of those modern species for patterns of similarity and difference. So for example, if I find something that's only present in humans, it must have emerged in the last couple of million years since we split apart from the other apes. Now, if I find something that's true in the humans, the chimps and the bonobos, but we don't see it in the gorillas or the orangutans, we can push back that date of origin to maybe 5 or 6 million years. And if we see it in all of the great apes, but perhaps not in the small apes like the gibbons or other monkeys, we can go all the way back to 16 or 17 million years and say the simplest explanation for all of the modern species having this behavior is that it emerged in our common ancestor and we've all just inherited that ever since. All right. Now, wild apes themselves have an incredibly rich communication system. It is so diverse. I mean, they have everything from that bright pink estrus swelling that is showing that that female down in the bottom corner is fertile, to pantoots that can carry 2 kilometers through a rainforest, to all of the small play faces and kisses and hugs between friends or after fights. They have an incredible diversity of their own rich communicative signals going on. And so what I do is I explore apes' own communication and humans' own natural communication to see where we overlap and also where we're different. Now, one of the things that I try to do is, instead of just coming at this from the perspective of chimp communication and language, we try and break it down a little bit more. And the reason for that is really because if I asked 10 different linguists what language was, I would get 10 different answers from them. Nobody really agrees on any of this. So it helps us if we can break it down into these more manageable small chunks, like what's the lexicon? What kind of meanings are there? What kind of dictionary do we have? How do you put that together in some kind of combination like syntax or grammatical structure? So we'll dip our toe today very quickly into 3 of the big ones. But first I will introduce you to the rainforest, where I get to usually spend most of my time. So Budongo is up in the northwest corner of Uganda. It's home to about 600 chimpanzees, and it's on the border with DRC. But those 600 chimpanzees are split into different communities, and I get to work with 2 of them. So I get to work with Sonso and I get to work with Waibira. And our camp is pretty comfortable for a rainforest field camp. We have solar power, we have showers, we have warm showers if someone remembers to light a fire under the shower bucket before we come home from the forest. So it's a pretty kind of comfortable life despite being in a rainforest. But the most important thing for me is we're at the heart of our chimpanzees' range and lives. And every single day I get to be a part of all of the little daily important and not so important things that make up their day-to-day kind of existence there. Now, the last question, I suppose, before we get into what chimp communication looks like is, why go all the way out here to look at it, right? I could still look at natural communication in zoos and sanctuaries. What do the chimps do to each other in all of those sanctuaries that are scattered kind of around the world? And in those sanctuaries where I can get up at a civilized hour of the day and have a decent cup of coffee before going to work, instead of getting up at 3:30 a.m. in the morning and trudging through the rainforest on instant. Well, why not ask the questions I want to ask in a zoo? I mean, the other things that are difficult for us in the forest is that, you know, those chimps are pretty big. An adult chimpanzee is about my size and about my weight, but they're dark and the forest is big, and you learn very quickly that the more beautiful the forest, the harder it is to find those little dark chimpanzees that are running around in it. And the prettier something looks like in the forest, the more you should very definitely not touch it under any circumstances. So fundamentally, the reason why I put up with the ants in the socks, the spiky things that want to sting me or eat me or do whatever else it is they're going to do, and the constant rain, because I often get kind of caught by my family and friends going, why don't you have more of a tan if you work in Africa? And I point out I work in a rainforest where it is dark and it is cold. We're at quite high altitude and it rains most days of the year. But the reason that I persist with this is I'm a pretty old school ethologist at heart. And I think that all behavior, now that includes our behavior, is an adaptation to the environment that we're in. And just as it's important to understand how human behavior operates in the human world, I want to understand how chimpanzee behavior operates in the chimpanzee's world. And in captivity, you can see where there's flexibility. You can see what an extraordinary individual like Coco can do under extraordinary circumstances. And then under those circumstances, yes, they can achieve extraordinary things. But that's not what gorilla communication looks like. That's not what chimpanzee communication looks like. And it's not how we can ask these evolutionary questions that we're interested in. All right, and I will run you through a little bit of what it's like to be a wild chimpanzee. So if you are a wild chimp running around in East Africa in the rainforest in Uganda, then if we take Waibira, then you're living in a group with about 120 other chimpanzees. They will include everyone from the baby that was born a few weeks ago to the 66-year-old matriarch grandmother who has ruled the forest for decades. You've got cousins and uncles and aunties and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and the whole suite of all relationships in there. Now compare that to what it's like in captivity, where you've got 10 or 15 chimps. They are probably mostly on birth control because you can't just let, more and more chimps in a small space. So you end up with no children, probably no grandparents. They're often not related to each other because they've all been brought in and moved around. So who you have to communicate to is dramatically different if you're living in a wild group. The kind of things that people often think about when they think about what it's like to be in a zoo or what it's like to be in the forest is the environment, right? Even if you are in the best zoo in the world, where people have put huge amounts of money and time and care into providing the best facilities possible, and many of them really do care for their apes with everything they can, it's not the same. You can't ever recreate hundreds of kilometers of rainforest. And you can't recreate the kind of behaviors that come with that. So my chimps, they fight with the neighbors, sometimes killing each other. They go hunting for monkeys. I think in a zoo it's frowned on to eat the neighboring exhibit. They will go patrolling. They will play. They will spend days trying to get the right girl that they can take away. Now compare that with captivity, where in these big open grassy enclosures, there's not a lot to do, relatively speaking. You don't have to go searching for food because you can't not feed them for a few days. That would be unethical. And that means they've got tons of time and tons of energy, and they spend a lot of time playing. So what they're communicating about in those two environments is also really quite dramatically different. A little bit of a reality check. At the moment, on a back of the envelope calculation, I have spent about 25,000 hours of my life in a rainforest trying to find a wild chimpanzee and film it for research. I had a slight existential breakdown when I did the math the other day, and I was like, really? Okay. Now in captivity, you can get beautiful, rich data. I know exactly where somebody's been all day, who they've been with, what they've been doing. I can collect data in a few years that takes me decades in the wild. But fundamentally, the reason I still do it, and I still go out to rainforests in Africa, is this one. The reason we have communication is to communicate with somebody, right? We need to share information, ideas, whatever it is that's going on. And those social relationships are so different. So if you are in a wild chimpanzee, there are going to be some individuals I hang out with every day. Some I meet once a week, some I meet less than once a year. I still need to communicate with them. If I'm in a captivity, I might not see you 24/7, but I can certainly hear you. I know where you've been, what you've been up to, who you were with, and what you were doing. So the information that I want to share or find out is just radically different again. And it's why it's so important that despite the sterling work that you can do in captivity, we have to also go and spend our time running around rainforests and trying to find out what it means to communicate as a chimpanzee in their natural environment. Alrighty. So what does that actually look like? Well, probably one of the first things you notice if you spend any time with wild chimps is they are incredibly vocal. They are such drama queens. You will, the whole forest will be just screams breaking out everywhere, and you discover it's because somebody dropped one piece of fruit from a tree that is covered in fruit. It's just, they're so, vocalization all of the time. So actually, wait a sec. So let's see. That's basically basically how the day starts and goes on. That is my early morning alarm clock. Actually, normally I'm up long before them if I go on a forest day, because I have to be there when they wake up. But if I'm trying to have a lie-in at camp at about 6:15 every morning, that's what wakes me up. Occasionally they drum on the side of my house if they really would like me to wake up. But you notice their vocalizations immediately. But what you also notice when you spend a bit of time with them is that these are basically broadcast calls. They're just broadcasting information all day, every day. Now, when you spend a little bit more time with them, what you realize is they have other systems of communication that are more subtle, and they have an incredible array of hand and body movements that, unlike the vocalizations, are being used in a one-to-one communication to request something specific. And they start in some interesting ways to actually look a lot more like what we do with language. So one of the things to remember is actually most animal communication is this broadcast type of information. So that little caterpillar is broadcasting, do not touch me because I will hurt you. But a lot of birdsong and monkey calls and communication that goes on every day when you walk around the world outside, whether you're in San Francisco or Uganda, is broadcast information put out there to the world. And we do that too. So this is this isn't something that we have switched for language. Language comes on top of this, because if I give you an example, if I am in the kitchen and I pick up a hot kettle that's on the stove and I burn my hand by accident, I'm going to scream, right? I'm going to yell. Now, if you're sat in the kitchen, you can very well, from my behavior, work out what happened. You get information from the vocalization that I just broadcast to the kitchen. But I'm going to yell whether or not you're there. I'm not yelling because you're there. I would have yelled if there was no one in the room. I would have yelled if there were 100 people in the room. I'm just yelling as a reaction to that stimulus. And what I would do with language would be really different. I mean, I could choose to tell one person and not somebody else to watch out, the kettle is hot, even if I'm not touching it anymore. Maybe I choose to I don't tell you because you were sat there and I know you know, but the person that comes in the kitchen 2 seconds later, I tell them, watch out, the kettle's hot. So rather than broadcasting information, sharing ideas in this one-on-one kind of way is what we do with language. And it revolutionized our understanding of non-human communication when we basically realized that great ape gestures are being used in this language-like way. Now, today there are a few other signals that we've been able to pick up that are being used in this way, but it's usually 1s and 2s here and there. And it's only in great ape gesture that we have these rich repertoires of signals that look a lot like human language in terms of how they're being used and what they're being used for.
So, Kat, I've got 2 questions in the queue.
Please,
The second one is, have you come to any conclusions about whether chimps have a sense of humor?
Have we come to any conclusions about whether chimps have a sense of humor? I was asked a few years ago to give a talk on the evolution of humor, of laughter, and I said I don't really study that. And then they said, well, it's in Paris, and I said, well, I'm sure I can think of something to talk about. And one of the things that we did was almost as a kind of little exercise, we said, right, what do you need to tell a knock-knock joke? What kind of capacities do you need to successfully tell a very simple joke? You need a system of communication. You need an it's funny signal. You probably need to be able to talk about something that's not directly in front of you at the time, because often when you're telling a joke, it's about this thing that happened last week, or haha with the bartender, whatever. And chimps definitely have an it's funny signal. They laugh the way we do. They certainly can communicate very clearly different ideas between them. But what we don't see very much of is them communicating about things that are not directly in front of them. And so I'm not sure whether or not you'd be able to, I mean, the only thing that I can think of that would come close to a sense of humor, I mean, if you see young chimps wrestling, they are giggling away to themselves. They find it hysterically entertaining to dangle off a branch above the alpha male's head and bounce up and down on top of him. The alpha male, not so much, so perhaps he doesn't have the sense of humor. But we don't see anything like, I don't know, if you take a pratfall, right? If I fall flat on my face in the forest, then I fully expect my field assistant to burst out laughing because it's what I'd do if he fell over. I have seen chimps take a total pratfall in front of other chimps and nothing. So I'm not sure if it's not there or if I don't know how to detect it, but we haven't seen anything that really looks like that yet.
Okay, 2 more questions have come in. When you visit, are you recognized? Do you have relationships with certain animals?
Definitely. So the chimps know me. They know me both as a researcher rather than a stranger, but also me as Cat. And there were a couple of ways that I know that that's the case. So I've had young students who've come out with me. I had one student who, we were the same height, the same build, the same hair color from a distance in the forest walking past. And one of the young chimps who knew me very well, because I'd known her since birth, but she was about 7 or 8 at the time, came barreling up because we don't interact with the chimps at all. I want to study their natural behavior. So my job is to be a slightly annoying tree that follows them around the rainforest, but kind of stays as much in the background as possible. But the young chimps sometimes will kind of test their boundaries. So they'll come running up to your feet and slap the ground and then take off at 100 miles an hour to see what you do. And Night was going through one of those phases and she came running up, but she came running up to Alice instead of me, got to within about 2 feet of her and then put the brakes on. It was like, oh, you're not a cat. And then kind of, so it clearly just had that moment of recognition, but a little bit too late. So they do know. And sometimes if I've been away for a while and one's kind of going past quickly, they'll do a sort of double take of, oh, you're back. I mean, that's about as much as it ever gets, but I'm sure they do know who I am.
Okay, there's another question here. Any observations as to how our projected contactless technology-driven communication modes might do to human communication?
It's really fascinating, isn't it? This whole exercise of us all being shelter in place or lockdown, and how some parts of it work so well, some parts of it really fall apart. So I was fascinated when texting really took off with kind of the advent of just mobile phones being something that everybody had, because that's about the same time as emojis really took off. And when you write these short little text messages that we use, like we're not even firing emails off, we're doing these one-line kind of text chats, you lose all of the prosody. You lose all of the sense of somebody's joking or not joking, so you have to put the winky face. You lose all of the sense of intimacy. You lose the sense of connection that comes with hearing the tone of someone's voice, or the speed and the familiarity and the kind of, I mean, I am a gesture person, I gesture a lot, but all of that expression is stripped out. And I think if we're speaking on the phone, you still get all that tone and prosody going on, that sort of like that rhythm of the speech that that's familiar to us. But in text in particular, it's so impoverished that we had to ram that back in by coming up with all of these different emojis that we pepper across our kind of text messages and emails. And it's been interesting now that technology's kind of caught up enough to be able to provide us with the opportunity to put back what we were missing. And that the minute we could video chat, we wanted that over these other more simple forms, because we know that there's something important they're missing. I do think it's still not completely natural or intuitive to me. That sort of back and forth doesn't flow in quite the same way in our team meetings as it does, but we're getting more used to it. And I think I was fascinated by an anecdote from a friend of mine whose young child was growing up with Skype. So little one, about 3 or 4 years old. And he'd been Skyping Granny and he'd been Skyping his auntie, and he was Skyping with Granny, and he asked Granny to go and get auntie, because for him, he understood how Skype worked. He understood that they were not in the same place he was, but he just assumed that everybody was in the Skype place and that she could just go and get auntie and bring her on camera. So I think the opportunities to study the impact on how our understanding of relationships and communication will shift when you grow up with this. I mean, for us as adults, I mean, you can teach old dogs new tricks, but it takes a lot more effort and energy, whereas young children are they're growing up in this environment with it. And I think they'll be the ones that are going to be the most impacted by these changes. And in 10 years' time, it'll be fascinating to see what shifts there have been.
Great. There's a few more questions in the chat window, but I think I'm going to let people ask their own questions when you're done with your presentation. That way people can do follow-up and gesture and all that kind of thing.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, that way I can also see people when they're kind of asking me, which I really like. Well, hey, I'll whiz through this bit a little bit because I do want the opportunity just to be able to let you ask questions and talk. But I guess I wanted to show you just how incredibly impressive I think, you know, these gestures are and what they look like. So one thing I'd like to do is just show you what it looks like when chimps are gesturing to each other. So this is Zephyr and Rahara. Object shaking and scratching, waiting. Object shaking and scratching, waiting. Rahara is an old lady. This takes a while. He has to do it one more time. Object shake, scratch, and this time adds that little arm raise, and that seems to do the trick, right? She comes, takes her time. Rahara is one of our senior lady chimps, but she gets it and she comes down. So those are the kind of interactions that I'm coding. And one of the things that is really difficult for us to do is go from seeing those behaviors and then working out what's going on in somebody's mind. Now, one of the reasons that to me, gesture doesn't look like a broadcast signal is what we saw going on there. And I always make this analogy with, if I want coffee in the morning, which I do every single morning, then my need for coffee, the stimulus leading to my signal production, is a constant state. But what I don't do is just say coffee, 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 until the coffee appears. I would, come to the table, come to the kitchen and say, please, could I have some coffee? And what I then do, because I'm communicating with you, you're my partner in this, I'm not just broadcasting, I wait for you to answer. And if you don't answer, or you do the wrong thing and you give me the tea or something else, then I would do it again. And if I have to do it a couple of times, maybe I'm going to elaborate and add another signal. But that process of back and forth, of waiting for responses, of persisting, that's how we recognize what happens in our language, rather than what happens when we stub a toe or walk into a room and see a snake in it. And that's this difference we see between those vocalizations that are just going off all day, every day, and these lovely gestural interaction back and forth that we get with the chimps. Now, since we know that they share this foundation with human language, we can break down those little parts that we were going to take a look at before. We say, okay, what's our lexicon? What are we dealing with? What kind of signals are there? Because maybe there's 5 or 6 different gestures. Well, it turns out that there are over 80 of them with the chimpanzees. And if anybody does want to take a bit more look at what these look like, I stuck our website down there at the bottom. It's the Great Ape Dictionary. And we have dozens of different signals. This isn't like, apes can use a sort of reach and a fling. This is over 80 at this point. It's this incredible rich communication system. But something that I found really fascinating in the last few years as we started to stretch it out is that all of the apes share many of those gestures. So if I'm a chimpanzee, 30 or 40 of my gestures are the same as the gestures used by all the apes. And another 30 or so are shared between the chimps and the gorillas, and another couple, the chimps and the bonobos. So there's only a couple of gestures that as a chimp I use that are unique. And to get these kind of pictures, what we have to do is work across all the different species. I'm getting to work with the mountain gorillas now, which is, it's just wonderful. It's incredible. But after we filled in all of those different species holes, there's still one hole missing. And it's the thing that has always driven me a little bit potty. And that is, where do we fit into the picture, right? So one of the things that I think people don't necessarily realize all the time is that we know chimpanzees are our closest relatives, but we forget that we're also their closest relatives. We are much more closely related to them than they are to a gorilla. Now that means that if the chimps and the gorillas have all of this in common, 80% of their repertoire is in common, then we should be in on that picture. We're apes too, we're much more closely related to the chimps. Like, what happened, basically? Is our biological inheritance somehow gone? What happened to it? It seems really odd. but we can't test our hand movements when we're speaking because we have language. So finding something to compare it to was always this complete conundrum to kind of work out, all right, what are we going to go and study? And so we thought, as good biologists, we would do what comes naturally to us, and we would treat humans like the apes they are. And we would use our field methods, which is taking a camera, getting up in the morning, finding someone and just following them for the day and seeing what it is that they do and how they move. Now, the people that we chose to do this with were the tiny apes, basically. We chose 1 to 2 year old children. This is my goddaughter, Eris. And the reason that we chose the youngsters is because they're just starting to use human language. They know how it works. 1 to 2 year olds are starting to use words, but they don't have all the vocabulary yet to express what they want to express. So we thought, if our ape ancestry, our ape heritage is going to come out anywhere, maybe these kids who know how to communicate, they want to use language, they're just on the cusp of it, maybe that's where it's going to be. Because if I hold my palm out like that, you guys have an idea of what that might mean. Or if I went like that and went, shoo, get lost. You know, there are some gestures that we do use that are familiar. So we thought, right, let's have a little look and see what these tiny apes are doing. And what we found kind of blew our minds, because we didn't just find a few, we found over 50 different gestures that they were using. And what really blew our minds was that almost all of them are present in chimps. A couple that weren't are present in gorillas. And so it really looks like ape species have been using this ancestral gestural system of communication for 16, 17 million years. And the same gestures that we see used today by orangutans, chimps, and gorillas and bonobos are being used by young children before they have full access to their language system. So it's still a part of our heritage. It's just that it gets overwritten at some point when language starts to come online. All right, we can whiz through the last 2 bits, because the other part of this puzzle is, if you have a system of communication, you want to know what it means, right? That's what everybody always asks me, okay, what does this mean? What does that mean? And it was always this point of frustration, because for years we couldn't tell anybody, what does it mean? It's this real challenge to, you know, Tinbergen. I love this cartoon. It's one of my favorite ones, where, you know, can we interview an animal in its own language? If this animal is producing these really weird sounds at us, would we even recognize a language that wasn't our own, even if it was rich and complex, and in this case happened to be Spanish, that the dolphins had decided to use? Maybe they've swum up from Mexico, I don't know. But it's this real challenge. I mean, I'm sure, well, hopefully I'm not the only one who knows how difficult it is to know what a member of our family means, right? We have all put our foot in it spectacularly and gotten that wrong at times and had to deal with the consequences. When it's a stranger who speaks our own language, when it's a stranger who doesn't speak our own language but is also a human being, it's almost impossible for us, you know. I'm very lucky. I grew up speaking a lot of languages, but none of them were tonal languages. And my attempts to speak Thai or Vietnamese are disastrous in so many ways. So how do I work out what another species, what an animal with a completely different mind and a completely different system means when they're communicating? And I'll walk you through how we try and do that and see what you guys think about it. So usually in animal communication, the way that everybody tackles this problem is to say, what's the context? And we go, okay, these gestures are used while we're fighting, these gestures are used while we're feeding, these gestures are used while we're playing. So this is the food gesture, this is the play gesture, this is the fighting gesture. And the problem with that is it doesn't really get you to meaning. Because imagine that we had a gesture that meant stop. Now, I could use that stop gesture when we were feeding. I could say stop when we're playing, I could say stop when we're traveling, stop when we're fighting. And if all I do as a scientist is say, what's the context it was used in, it makes it look like it has no meaning. Whereas actually, as a signaler, it has a very clear meaning that I want to communicate. So context doesn't work for us. And we wanted to be able to go beyond that. So the next thing people tried was saying, all right, if they go with my I need coffee sign in the morning, I need coffee signal, what happens next? Maybe that tells us something about what the signaler means. Well, the problem with that is that what might happen next is they could tell me to get lost and get my own coffee. They could do something terrible and pass me a cup of tea just because they assume from context I'm British and I must want tea. So just seeing what happens next also is not going to get you to what the signaler wants to communicate. But we're getting a bit closer, because what we look at is not what happens next, but what stops the signaler from signaling. So if you passed me the tea, the next thing I'd do would be to signal quite clearly again that no, I'd like the coffee. And no matter what happens over the next kind of few minutes, I'm going to keep signaling that I need the coffee until one thing happens, which is you pass me the coffee. And then I'm going to stop because I've got what I wanted. So just as we saw with Zephyr and O'Hara when he was shaking because he wants to groom her, and he shook and he shook, and when she comes down to be groomed, then he stops. The thing that stops the signaler communicating is often close to what they wanted to achieve. Now, it's not going to be perfect, never is in science, and so we can take one gesture from one individual and see there's a bit of variation. But over all of those years in the forest, what we do is we take all the individuals and all the data and we build up the pattern. And what we can see here is the pattern of meaning that's associated with one gesture, slapping an object. And we can see that it's not one-to-one. So slap object actually has two meanings, and that's like language. If I say bark, I could be talking about tree, or I could be talking about a dog, and you might infer from context which one it was. But that makes a lot of sense, because this is not an urgent signal. If you have an alarm call, you know, your alarm call, you don't want any ambiguity in there. It's like, you know, it's like death or fire or run. You don't want anybody going, I wonder from context what she means. But gesture is not broadcast alarm call. It's one-on-one social relationships. It's like language. It's not like alarming. So you can have ambiguity, you can have flexibility. And we found that they have about 19 of these meanings, and that it's the same meaning for the same gesture no matter who you are, and even actually no matter which species you are. Chimps and bonobos mean the same thing when they use the same gesture. But some meanings are expressed by just one gesture, so quite simple. And some meanings are expressed by lots of different gestures. And again, like language, what's going on here is it might be about the subtlety of the relationship. So if I want to say, come and groom me, I can do that pretty straightforwardly as a chimp, no matter who I am. But if I want to say, stop that, then I probably want to have a little nuance in there if I'm saying that to my alpha male or my boss, as compared to my annoying little brother. So some of these more socially rich meanings need that nuance, need that flexibility to be able to express all of those day-to-day goals. All right, the very last piece of the puzzle, right, was syntax, and it's going to be a quick one, because what I can tell you is we are just starting to look at it. Because before you can look at grammar and structure and combinations, you need to work out what the signals are and what they mean. So we've done those parts. But the one thing that we just found very recently that we're quite excited by is this pattern that I'm going to show you. Now, hopefully it's familiar to you from any of the languages that you speak. So there's a law called Menserath's law. And all Menserath's law is it says the longer the sequence, the shorter the part. So if you have a long sentence, the words tend to be shorter. If you have a long word, the syllables tend to be shorter. And that is true of every language. It's true of all of the spoken ones and all of the signed ones. And so there's this consistent pattern in language. And we were really excited the other day to see that it actually works in our gestures too. The longer the sequence, the shorter the gesture. The shorter the sequence, the longer the gesture. So there's promise there. That's all I can really say about syntax. Don't know very much about it, but there's a little bit of promise in looking into it. All right, I will wrap up a little bit by saying we put all the pieces together, but at this point, I should be really delighted. I should say, right, 15 years well spent. I now know they've got a lexicon, semantics, syntax. They have these large repertoires of gestures. They're used in everyday communication. We know that they have true meaning. They're not just broadcasting information. They look like language, turn-taking, all of those kind of things. but it still doesn't look like language, right? If I showed you that video of Zephyr and Rahara and I hadn't given you this whole spiel to try and convince you, you probably wouldn't have said, oh, well, that's clearly language. This is not poetry. This is not, you know, this is not even a knock-knock joke on the internet. And the frustrating part of it for me is that I don't think the way we've been looking at it is necessarily the way that we should be thinking about this. And there's a guy called Sidney Brenner, who was a molecular biologist, who talked about DNA an awful lot. And he said the difference between the telephone directory and Shakespeare's play is that both have a grand cast of characters, but only the play has a plot. Now, the basic system, the toolkit available to you, if you are a human or a chimpanzee, it's all there. You've got intentional communication, you've got gestures, you've got meaning. We can put them together and combine them. But language is different because of what we use it for, not because of the toolkit that's available. And as scientists, we've been exploring to try and work out what the toolkit is, but we haven't really yet got stuck into this much bigger question for me of what is language used for? How do we use it? What do we do with it? You know, we've made a bit of progress on what the cast of characters are, but we can't tell the difference between a phone book or a Shakespearean play yet. So it's something that I'm really excited to get into moving forward. And I think I'll probably leave it, well, okay, I'll give you this one last kind of teaser and then I promise to stop talking and we can chat about questions.
Yeah, we need to get to questions. Thanks.
Sorry.
It's okay.
The last little teaser I'd like you to then think about, or just to leave you with, is we think about stone tool use as being our ancestral state of tool use. And we actually know that great apes and many other primate species were using stone tools millions of years ago too. And we saw from JJ at the beginning that he's still using stone tools. And we have San Francisco, we have New York City, we have Zoom conferences across multiple time zones. But what fascinates me as a scientist is that if I was to ask you to guess how long ago we stopped using stone tools, then I am betting that not too many of you would have guessed that it was just a heartbeat ago in evolutionary time, 20,000 years. That is nothing to an evolutionary scientist. That is no time for us to change our bodies. That is no time for us to change our brains. Our toolkits haven't changed. What we do with those toolkits in terms of language and culture and learning and teaching seems to be what is driving what we see today as the differences between human apes and all of the other apes. So I will leave it there and say thank you very much. But yeah, please, I will come out of the presentation and then we can link.
You were out. So, Paul, did you have a question?
Oh, wait. Why can't I see?
Yeah, my question was, do you have to worry about communicating diseases to the apes? And if so, what precautions take to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, right now, today, one of the reasons that I'm sitting here talking to you guys and not in a forest is to do with that. So apes, particularly chimps and bonobos, are vulnerable to almost all of the same respiratory infections that we are. And that's better now. I can see everybody again. So the kind of precautions that we're all getting used to right now in our daily lives, I do every day in the forest. So I wear a mask. I keep a social distance. I'm a few meters from them. I'm disinfecting everything. And that's because all of the rhinoviruses and coronaviruses, the kind of thing that gives us a bit of a sniffle, like the common cold, that's actually lethal in the chimps. And so we have to be so, so careful. And now with COVID, I mean, we know there was a coronavirus a few years ago that passed from humans to the chimps in Ivory Coast, and it killed quite a few of them. So their mortality seems to be higher than ours. We know how dangerous COVID is for us, and therefore we're really quite worried if this gets into the wild ape populations, we're going to be looking at local extinctions. So my field site is completely locked down right now. We have teams in the forest still because ironically, we have to be in the forest, because if we're not there patrolling, they get hunted, they get poached. Local people under lockdown are starving right now. It's incredibly tough, the decisions they're having to make. And so we have to still be there, but we're keeping 20-meter distances, and we're wearing like particularly kind of like clear masks, and we're just trying to do everything we can to keep them as safe as we can. And we're just not sure what that will bring long term, because we might get a vaccination, we might get treatments. It's very unlikely we'll be able to use that in chimp populations. So the only thing we can do to protect the chimps is to effectively eradicate it in the humans who might give it to them.
That was my question.
Red Davis, did you have a question?
I do not.
Okay. Don Jenkins, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Paul asked the same question I was thinking about, so.
Okay. Anyone else? Speak up. Unmute yourself and speak up.
Hey, Kat, have you seen any of the apes, the chimps, mimicking you, right? Like they're observing you. What have you seen in that way?
They do pay attention to us. Now, in captivity, that happens quite a lot, and that's probably because they're bored enough to want to spend time, to waste time on that kind of thing. Our chimps, like I said, when they're very young, they hang with their mother, and then at about 3 or 4 years old, they go through this phase of starting to sort of, I know, there was one young girl who used to drop sticks on my head to see whether or not she could get any kind of reaction out of me, and I'd have to stand there and ignore them. But usually by the time they get to 8 or 9, they kind of forget about us again because they're too busy being chimps. But anecdotally, there was, luckily it was an empty sample bottle, but it was just a little plastic tube with a screw lid. Someone had dropped it in the forest, thankfully empty and therefore safe. And one of those, actually, Night, the little girl who was spending a lot of time, she would follow me around the forest. She was clearly going through a phase of kind of paying attention to us. She picked it up and unscrewed it. Now, that, it seems like a small thing, but that blew our minds. Like, they have got no experience of that. That makes no sense. If anything, you'd think she'd be pulling on it, but she must have been paying quite careful attention. So it's not so much mimicking a sort of, like our behavior, but certainly picking things up from us, I think, is something we have to be really careful about.
Fred Stomba, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I think I do. I was thinking when Kat was talking about humor and a knock-knock joke, one of the things I think that makes humor for humans is the idea of misdirection, that the beginning of the story leads the listener to some sort of an expected conclusion, and then something different happens, and that's where the humor is. I expect that to be really hard to see in apes, but that just occurred to me.
The only thing I can think of that's at all relevant to it is the ability to deceive is probably there. And I have some lovely videos at the moment from, so Zhe, the chimp who had the 2 rocks, he lives in one of the few communities that use these stone tools, and they're really valuable. And if you are a young chimp, you basically just have to wait your turn. There's only a few of them around. Chimps have a pretty strict hierarchy. If you try and kind of, like you can't just go and take the stone from a big male. He's going to cuff you around the ear pretty strictly about that. But this young guy, Flanley, was, what he was doing was he was running up to the alpha male, and he would invite the alpha male to play. And the alpha male would be like, oh, okay, and kind of leave the stones. And at which point Flanley would be like, and thank you very much, and swipe and run off with the stone. Now, it could just be that he wanted to play and then he saw an opportunity, but something that I think is super interesting about this little guy is that when a chimp wants to play, they have, it's called a play face. It's basically a big smile with kind of, the teeth showing, often with the lips covering. It's really characteristic, and it's almost a reflexive thing. It's like us laughing or something. They can't not make a play face if they want to play. And Flanley never had a play face on when he was doing these play solicitations. So I really think that before he started, he fully knew what he was going to do. And we've now got dozens of these examples. So the potential to at least sort of misdirect might be there as a capacity. But yeah, how we would start to explore I mean, even if chimps were talking about something that isn't present in front of them, how do I see that? I think that's been always this problem for us is we have to have some kind of thing happening for us to be able to get data.
Kat
Kat,
Flaherty, I see. Yeah, go ahead.
thank you. Kat, if do they mourn if one of their pals dies?
I think I would say, yeah, I know that there are people who find it a little bit controversial to say that, but I do. I think I've seen quite a few deaths. If you have a young chimp that's orphaned, or a mum that loses a baby, they go through a period of being, I mean, if they were human, you'd say they were mourning. They're withdrawn socially. They often don't eat, they don't walk, they sit quietly in a corner. They go through a period of days, sometimes weeks, of just withdrawing into themselves socially. And that's to me, that just seems, you see sometimes young chimps come up and want to play with them and they're just not interested. So I do think, I haven't seen it so much perhaps between adults, and maybe that's just harder to recognize, but certainly orphans and mums that lose their babies, I think, go through something like mourning, yeah.
Paul Fellinger, did you have a question?
Yes. Am I still muted?
Nope, you're ready to go.
Kat, the most interesting part of your presentation was that cartoon about, looked like it was a play on John Lilly's work with dolphins. Two questions. One, whatever happened to all of his work on trying to understand dolphins? And the other is, how much work, you talk about thinking outside of the box, how much work is being done on that very idea that their language may not be at all like ours and they're communicating in another way? That really sounds fascinating. But what about John Lilly?
I don't know actually what happened really to that line of research. There's very little or his work, there's very little that has come out in terms of any scientific publications lately. We actually have an amazing whale and cetacean communication group here at St. Andrews, but they're mostly working with wild individuals. But it's a lot of the problems they come up against is this challenge of underwater communication. We're so biased to, like, how do we start to pull apart a system that includes something like echolocation? There are amazing observations that were made of dolphins who would be free to communicate with each other, and you sort of see the communication going on, you see some of the behavior that's happening afterwards in zoos and in captivity, but it's often trained, it's often something that has been shaped, and when we train and shape to look like our system of communication, because that's what we recognize. And I don't know how we get away from that, how we kind of get to first principles. The only thing that I can think of that we've done recently relating to this idea of coming out of the human perspective is, a few years ago, I actually wanted to ask the question, like, what is a gesture from a chimp's perspective? Because I might say, this is one gesture, and this is a completely different gesture because I've got two hands, or maybe this is one gesture and this is a completely different gesture. But it doesn't matter what I think. It matters whether or not a chimp sees it that way. Do they perceive the difference between the different signals? And so what we did was we took all of the body movements in all of our gestures, split them down to the finest grained kind of system possible with 3,000 different gestures. And then we said, right, if all of these things are used to achieve the same sort of thing, we're going to lump them. And what we tried to do in doing that was saying, it doesn't matter to me as a human looking at it, saying, this is signal A, that's signal B. If the chimp is treating them both like they're achieving the same thing, we should treat them as signal A, because my perception is irrelevant in this. It's their perception that matters, and starting to try to take their perspective. Now, I can do that for a chimp because I have a sense of what it means to move your body as a chimpanzee, but as a dolphin, as a cetacean, where there are potential systems of communication that we don't even know where to start. It's really challenging. There's some fascinating work being done at the moment on octopus cognition. I mean, how do you know if an octopus is angry or hungry? Like, if if they're kind of giving a signal, like, where do you, I mean, I can recognize that in a chimp, but I don't know where to start in an octopus. And we actually were approached by METI, the Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence guys, because they want us to try and work through a system of saying, right, we've potentially got in touch with aliens. How do we start to talk to them when their bodies are different, their communication, their environment, everything about it is different? Where do we even start? So we're trying to take that approach and say, right, what is...
Amazing that we're even thinking about these things.
Say that again,
A quick
sorry.
one, Don.
Yes, quick one. No, I'm not muted. Is there any sense of ethic within the clan, or is it just the largest ape decides what's going to happen, or is there a sense of ethics as we as humans have evolved?
So you can, as a male chimpanzee, you can sort of rise to be dominant, rise to be high ranking and influential in two ways. You can be the biggest, strongest guy, or you can be a good politician that makes strong friends and allies. And if you are the biggest, strongest guy and you beat everybody up to get to the top, you might make it, but you don't often last very long. And when you start to fall, you fall fast because everybody is going to kick you back. Whereas the politicians tend to have more stable kind of stable positions over a longer time because they're making bonds and allies and sort of sharing food and sharing access and supporting each other. And they do police a little bit. You will see, for example, if two individuals, or if one individual is beating somebody else up, sometimes a third person will come in and stop that from going on. So ethics is probably a little bit would be very structured, would be very formalized, but a sense of justice, injustice maybe, or rights and wrong ways to behave as a chimp, I think we could probably start to get to that kind of level.